It's my great pleasure for this week to introduce Lauren Feldman, who many of you know from the literature. And for those of you who don't know her, she's a faculty member at the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University, the State University of New Jersey. Her work falls probably squarely somewhere between political communication, a lot of work on climate and politics, and science communication with a pretty heavy footprint on an area of science communication that I think is getting more and more important. And that is entertainment, media, and humor and comedy. And I think a lot of what she'll be talking about today deals with that. She has a lot of direct and indirect connections, even to the department, either having been colleagues with people that are close to the department. Matt Nisbet, a former colleague at American. I think Todd and I were talking this morning that he just came into American as a PhD student, as Lauren, as you were leaving, and going to Rutgers. So he was in the faculty at American before that, got her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, the Amherst School for Communication. And something that I didn't know when I read your bio, as a BA in English from Duke, I just for some reason never had realized that. Most importantly, and I think this is what the talk will focus on, partly she's a co-author of a book that just came out about a year ago. A comedian and an activist walk into a bar, the serious role of comedy in social justice, with the University of California Press. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren. As always, if you have questions, put them in the chat, raise your hand with the reaction buttons at the bottom. I'll make sure that I monitor it, and then either get your questions fed into the Q&A if you want to type them in the chat, or ask you to jump in to unmute. So Lauren, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Dina, for that great introduction and for having me here today. I'm really thrilled to be here and also to see some familiar faces in the audience. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you all see that? Yes, cool. Okay. So as Dietra mentioned, last year, perfectly timed with the start of the pandemic, I published a book co-authored with Katie Boram-Shetu at American University called A Comedian and an Activist Walk into a Bar, The Serious Role of Comedy in Social Justice. And so the book looks at the intersection of comedy and activism, and more broadly at the role that mediated comedy, so satirical news, sitcoms, sketch, stand-up, funny documentaries, can play in social change around issues from racial injustice to gun control to climate change. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to be with you all today and to get to talk about this book. What I'm going to do is talk briefly about the overarching arguments that we make in the book about comedy and social change, and then spend most of my time discussing why comedy can be useful for communicating about climate change, and the effects that comedy about climate change has on audience engagement with the issue, based on an experiment that we conducted. So we devote a full chapter in the book to comedy and climate change, and that's primarily what I'll be drawing from today. And so while comedy has a very long history of confronting injustice and calling for social change, in recent years, we've increasingly seen comedy in all forms take on serious social and political issues, both in the entertainment marketplace and in strategic advocacy communication. And I'll share just a few examples of what I mean, not necessarily related to science. So I'm sure you are all familiar with John Oliver and his show Last Week Tonight on HBO. And his show is particularly notable because he uses comedy to unpack complex, often really esoteric news issues in segments that often extend for 15 to 20 minutes, which is an eternity in the world of TV news and also in the world of satirical news. And many of these segments have gone insanely viral with 15 to 20 million or more views despite their length. He got a lot of attention in the first season of his show back in 2014, and then again in 2017 for driving his audience to comment to the FCC in support of net neutrality. But he has engaged audiences around dozens of important underreported policy issues, from bail reform to chicken contract farming to the National Flood Insurance Program, to just recently plastic pollution. Another example of comedy that engages social issues, this is Lena Waithe, and in 2017, she made television history when she was awarded an Emmy for outstanding writing for a comedy series, making her the first African-American woman to win in that category. And she won for her work on the Thanksgiving episode of the Netflix comedy Master of None. And the episode was based on her own experiences of coming out as a lesbian and gaining acceptance from her family, which was showcased in the episode through a montage of successive family Thanksgiving dinners. Another Emmy Award-winning sitcom, Blackish, took on police brutality in a 2016 episode called Hope, which was re-aired by ABC this last summer on Blackout Tuesday in the wake of George Floyd's death. Moving into the advocacy space, RISE is an organization founded by a young woman named Amanda Wynn, who was sexually assaulted while an undergrad at Harvard. And while that experience was, of course, traumatic, she had an even worse time navigating the legal system. For example, accessing her rape kit and her police report. And so she founded RISE in 2014 to advocate for civil rights for sexual assault survivors. And in 2016, she wrote a federal bill called the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights Act. She sent it to every member of Congress, got bipartisan sponsors for the bill, but it didn't go anywhere because it was an election year. And so she decided to partner with Funny or Die to create a sketch video called Even Supervillains Think Our Sexual Assault Laws Are Insane. And they timed the release of that video to when they dropped the bill in the Senate. And the video got a ton of attention and it drove signatures to a change.org petition, getting over 140,000 signatures, which they then delivered to Congress to show public demand for the bill. The bill ended up unanimously passing at the federal level. It was signed into law by Obama in October 2016. RISE then went on to do another Funny or Die video to launch their state level campaign to pass a survivor bill of rights in all 50 states. They did a third video to launch their international work with the UN and respond to the Me Too movement. And Amanda Wynn, who we interviewed for the book, has said that she really saw comedy as a way to make a depressing, difficult issue more palatable and also to build hope for change. And a little fun fact, she was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for this work in 2018 at the age of 27. And so those were just a few examples, but they give you a sense of the fact that we're seeing not only more and more comedy from diverse voices that takes on challenging social and political issues, but that this comedy is being rewarded by critics and fans. It's inspiring engagement and action, and in some cases, helping to change policy. And we're seeing this socially critical comedy not only thrive in the entertainment marketplace, but also play a strategic role in advocacy campaigns like the RISE initiative. And there are a few factors that we see as helping to explain why comedy has become such a unique force for confronting injustice and promoting social change as of late. First, declining trust in traditional media and government has left an opening for alternative sources of information about social and political issues. In tandem, we've seen the lines between entertainment and politics completely blurred over the last few decades. And because of this, entertainment and comedy have become incredibly important vehicles for serious political information. There's increasing recognition that pop culture is critical to shaping the political attitudes of citizens and fostering civic engagement. The new media environment has also opened up space for new comedy voices and perspective, as well as new forms of activism. So with the rise of cable and then streaming TV, such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, Apple, the goal no longer is to reach a mass audience, but a smaller niche or narrowly targeted audience. At the same time, these networks need a ton of programming content. And so as a result, they're more willing to produce controversial, risky comedy since they don't necessarily aim for mass appeal. And this has given us comedy shows like Atlanta and Transparent and Broad City and Insecure, which never would have been made 10 or so years ago. User-generated content on YouTube also allows aspiring comedians to develop and test out new material and build an audience. It also provides important tools for audiences to find, share, and engage with comedy. Because of the specificity of the the specificity and the interactivity of the digital audience, because they can easily signal what they like, what they want. This can provide important validation for socially critical humor that may not resonate with the random audience that happens to walk into a comedy club on a given night. And so in this way, the internet helps make clear that there are audiences who care about social justice and who love comedy, which changes the kind of comedy that gets produced and given a platform. And there are a lot of pretty high profile comedians who have gotten their start on YouTube, like Hassan Minhaj, Issa Rae, and others. Digital media also have become central to social movements. Digital media act as organizing agents, and movements are strengthened when individuals share their personal stories, experiences, and reasons for taking action on social media. And so this makes short comedy videos, which are really easily shareable, a critical tactic for driving media and public attention to social and political issues. And then finally, the last decade has seen rising public consciousness around social issues. We're obviously living in a very unique political moment that encompasses ongoing justice challenges exemplified by movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, March for Our Lives, and the school climate strikes. And this means that audiences are more interested in entertainment content that takes up serious issues as they try to make sense of those issues, become informed, and become more civically engaged. And the entertainment marketplace is therefore responding by greenlighting more of this kind of programming. And young people between the ages of 23 and 37, they're the most racially and ethnically diverse Americans in history. They're more supportive of social justice and equity than older generations. And this creates a market shift towards socially conscious entertainment content. So this kind of confluence of factors has given rise to what we consider a new era of socially critical or socially engaged comedy. And then we argue that comedy has some inherent properties that make it especially effective for facilitating social change around some of the most challenging issues that we face today as a society. Clearly social change is a gradual process that involves very large scale shifts in attitudes, norms, and behaviors over time. And so, certainly a comedy show cannot on its own produce sweeping change at the societal level, but it can grab people's attention. It can change how some people think and feel about social issues. It can spark conversation, and it can motivate activism. And so in turn, that incremental change in combination with other influences may, over the long haul, add up to a shift in a majority opinion or behavior within the culture, put pressure on elected officials to change relevant policy, and or create a broader climate for social change. And so in our book, we describe 4 key individual level effects that comedy can have on audiences that may help facilitate social change. And these are rooted in decades of research on comedy's effects. The first is increasing message and issue attention. So one of the most well-established findings in research about humor is its ability to increase attention and recall of message content. And so comedy can cut through the clutter and get people to pay attention to issues that they might not otherwise. Comedy also can disarm audiences and lower their resistance to persuasion. And so it can do this cognitively by reducing counter-arguing. There's a theory called the resource allocation theory developed by Dana Young. And Young argues that people will be less likely to counter-argue humorous messages because our attention and interest are focused on getting the joke. And so we have no cognitive resources left over to dissect and challenge the message's persuasive arguments. And so the persuasion sort of seeps in under the radar. Comedy also can lower our resistance to persuasion through an emotional route by helping to buffer against a perceived threat. Because of the positive emotions elicited by humor, people may be more willing to engage with threatening information when it's presented in a funny context. Comedic entertainment also can break down social barriers by visibly portraying marginalized groups in positive, relatable ways, providing opportunities for parasocial contact and social modeling that can help challenge stereotypes and foster more positive attitudes towards marginalized communities and other social groups, including potentially scientists. Comedy also stimulates online sharing and discussion. So there's research that shows that humorous content is especially likely to go viral. And sharing not only increases the reach of any particular message, thereby amplifying its potential effects, but sharing itself is also a form of engagement that can lead people to participate in other ways. Beyond its direct effects on audiences, comedy also can have broader cultural effects by influencing news coverage and social media discourse about the issues discussed in the comedy. John Oliver has had a lot of influence in terms of intermedia agenda setting effects, for example, and also providing visibility to alternative ideas and marginalized groups. So turning now to climate change and considering how comedy might be able to play a role here, I think it's first useful to consider the communication challenges that we face in getting people to care about and prioritize climate change. Even as we're seeing increasing attention to and political mobilization around climate change, it's really difficult to sustain public engagement with this issue and to foster support for the kind of large-scale systemic action we need to tackle it. And there are a number of reasons for this. First is just the nature of climate change itself, right? It's hard for people to see how their everyday activities contribute to climate change. We can't readily observe the climate changing, even if we occasionally experience or see extreme weather like the California wildfires last September that could be linked to global warming. Many of the worst impacts of climate change still may not be felt for a generation, and many of the present climate impacts continue to be most visible in remote polar regions. At the same time, when you think about solutions to climate change, these are really complex. They require massive collective action, and so they feel out of reach to the average individual. And so for all of these reasons, climate change is very distancing and overwhelming, and people respond just by pushing it out of mind. Second, as I'm sure you're all well aware, climate change is one of the most politically polarized issues in our country, with Democrats overwhelmingly supportive of climate action, Republicans dismissive of the problem. And this invites motivated reasoning, where efforts to promote engagement with climate change are often met with resistance, if not hostility, by conservative Republican audiences. And this is exacerbated by conservative media coverage of the issue, which downplays the seriousness of climate change and its links to extreme weather and plays up the economic cost of taking action. In general, news media, particularly on TV, tend not to focus much at all on climate change. And so this is a recent analysis from Media Matters, which shows that on broadcast TV, climate change comprised only 0.4% of their total news coverage in 2020. So about 380 minutes total across ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox Broadcasting's morning news programs, network evening programs, and the Sunday political talk shows. And then less than 30% of that coverage focused on solutions to climate change. And that's important because that lack of attention to solutions feeds into a doom and gloom narrative that is pervasive in media discourse around climate change. So this was a New York Magazine cover story from 2017 written by journalist David Wallace Wells, which emphasized worst case climate scenarios. It was the magazine's, at the time, most read story ever. I don't know if it still is. In 2019, Wallace Wells adapted the article into a book called The Uninhabitable Earth. And, so front and center in all this coverage is the terrible fate of climate change for the Earth, which of course is valid and important, but it doesn't emphasize what we can actually do about the problem. And much of our popular culture is also filled with doomsday imagery related to climate change. So going back a little bit, the 2004 film Day After Tomorrow was about a massive superstorm produced by climate change, which led to a global freezing event. More recent films like Mad Max, Fury Road, Snowpiercer all depict these kind of post-apocalyptic scenarios that are connected to climate change. And so all of this doom and gloom can be disempowering and overwhelming if it's not coupled with more hopeful information about solutions and how to take action. And then despite rising concern about climate change in the US, only about 13%, so just over 1 in 10 Americans have actually contacted their elected official to encourage them to take political action. So yes, people are concerned, or they say they're concerned about climate change, but they're not doing much in the political sphere. And so enter comedy, right? And while comedy is certainly not a cure-all for these problems, it does offer several distinct benefits as a form of climate change communication. So first, as I mentioned, it provides a way to engage public interest and attention. Comedy is fun and enjoyable, and by creating an entertaining media experience, it can draw people into an issue like climate change that they might not otherwise care about or think deeply about, while also making climate change seem more relatable and connected to everyday concerns. Second, humor elicits positive emotions. And so comedy may be a way to counter some of the fatigue and despair associated with climate change by increasing hope and in turn building efficacy. Even those Americans who are most engaged with and worried about climate change lack a sense of efficacy, which may help explain why so few have taken formal political action, like contacting their congressperson. And then finally, comedy may be a way to disarm audiences. As I mentioned earlier, past research has found that comedy about political issues can reduce message counter-arguing and thus open the way to persuasion. And so we're increasingly seeing comedians and comedy shows take up the issue of climate change in ways that might help elevate the issue in public consciousness. So satirical news programs like Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, and even Saturday Night Live have focused on climate change. And some of my older research has shown that satirical news programs can help promote attention to science and environmental issues, including climate change, among audiences, especially audiences with less formal education, for whom keeping up with science issues might be especially daunting. And so comedy can make science more accessible. And then sitcoms like The Simpsons, Modern Family, 30 Rock, Superstore, all have included climate-related storylines. And sitcoms in particular have the potential to reach unexpected audiences who don't ordinarily seek out information about climate change with funny, relatable arguments for climate action. In addition to those examples in entertainment programs, we also see environmental advocacy organizations intentionally incorporating comedy into their communication strategy as a way to promote action. And there are two examples in particular that we wrote about in the book. In 2016, the progressive advocacy organization Next Gen America, founded by billionaire and former presidential candidate Tom Steyer, developed a 5-episode web documentary series called Spotlight California. And the series was hosted by a comedian, Kieran Dole. And in the series, she tours California and chronicles how the state's environmental problems, such as drought and air pollution, are impacting residents. And she intersperses these lighthearted, comic, funny moments with the documentary's otherwise very serious fact-filled content. And we interviewed the former VP for digital, the creative director at Next Gen America, who oversaw the project. And he explained how they really saw comedy as one of the best ways to make wonky policy issues more interesting and relatable to their young target audience. Similarly, the documentary's producer told us that she saw comedy as a way to make the environmental movement seem more fun and less didactic and preachy, so that it becomes something that people want to join and be a part of. Another example is from Defend Our Future, which is the millennial-focused environmental advocacy arm of the Environmental Defense Fund. And in 2016, they partnered with Funny or Die to create a video called Old People Don't Care About Climate Change, which features a group of older actors and comedians, you can see them pictured here, seemingly delighting in the fact that they don't care about climate change. So here's Ed Asner saying, worry about climate change, it's an after I'm dead problem. I still have while I'm alive problems, like finding comfortable shoes. And so the video uses satire to mock the sentiment that older people don't need to care about climate change because they won't be around to see its effects. But the comedy also calls attention to the generational cleavage around climate change, right? Today's young citizens are going to bear the brunt of a changing climate. They tend to worry about climate change more than older generations, yet they vote at starkly lower rates. And so the video ends with a serious call to action. It says, old people don't care about climate change. That's why you have to. Vote Climate. And so it used humor to grab attention and to help empower young people in the lead up to the 2016 election. And the video generated more than 6.5 million views and 94,000 shares on Facebook, which is pretty impressive for, an environmental advocacy video. The video was created as part of Defend Our Future's broader strategy to motivate young people to not only turn out to the polls, but also to prioritize climate change when voting. And they do much of this work through field-based voter registration drives, as well as creative media efforts like this one. And so the organization really saw this video as a way to make their name more recognizable and create goodwill, and ultimately help support their voter registration efforts. And they've experimented with a lot of unconventional messaging, including comedy. And their founding director, who we interviewed, talked about the challenge of trying to find the balance between the funny and what scientists at their parent organization, the Environmental Defense Fund, would be okay with, which is a significant challenge in these kinds of collaborations, but worked out in this case. And so, inspired in part by the Defend Our Future video, we conducted a messaging experiment to better understand how these kinds of popular marketplace approaches to comedy may actually be working to engage and mobilize audiences around climate change. So I'm gonna spend the rest of my talk talking about this study. And so we tested the effects of two short form comedy sketches from Funny or Die, including the Old People video produced with Defend Our Future. And we were interested in answering 3 research questions. So the first was, can this kind of short form comedy content actually help boost viewers' political engagement with climate change? And then we wanted to understand the cognitive and affective pathways via which comedy engages audiences compared to more serious didactic messaging. And here we focused on 3 potential mechanisms that tap into the benefits of comedy that I outlined earlier. So its ability to foster entertaining, enjoyable media experiences, to elicit hope versus fear, and to reduce counter-arguing. And then a final question was concerned with how these effects may differ across the political spectrum. One thing we noticed in our review of mediated comedy about climate change is there is a tendency for humor, particularly in satirical news, but also elsewhere, to target Republican deniers of climate change. This is kind of the low-hanging fruit of climate change comedy. And so we were interested in whether politically targeted climate change humor that explicitly calls out deniers works equally well across the political spectrum, or if it's alienating, as we'd expect, to conservative Republicans. And so our stimuli for this study included 2 Funny or Die sketches that I mentioned that were broadly similar, but differed in the targets of their humor. So one was politically explicit, one was not. So the first was the Old People Don't Care About Climate Change sketch that I described just a few moments ago. The second video was called Climate Change Denial Disorder, or CCDD, and it also satirizes people who aren't concerned about climate change, but it does it in a more politically targeted way. And so the video parodies a direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical ad, opening with a voiceover narrator asking, does your parent, grandparent, or political representative suffer from climate change denial disorder? CCDD is a rapidly spreading disease that World Health officials say, if left untreated, could destroy the entire planet. It then goes on to explicitly call out the quote 56% of Republicans in Congress who have been severely infected by CCDD. The voiceover identifies Republican senators and representatives who reject climate science by name, and their names and state affiliations scroll in text on the screen. Both videos end with a call to action that highlights the importance of political engagement with climate change. I mentioned earlier, the Old People video encourages viewers to vote. The CCDD video urges viewers to, quote, help Republicans in Congress who suffer from CCDD, ostensibly by voting them out of office, right? And so we were interested in how these 2 videos compared to a serious news video from CNN about the impacts of climate change, as well as to a funny non-climate video also from Funny or Die that served as our control group. And so we did an online experiment. We randomly assigned participants to watch one of these videos. And then we asked them questions about related to a couple of different political engagement outcomes. We asked about their perceived efficacy, meaning how much they thought they could influence what the government does on climate change. We asked how important climate change was to their vote choice in the 2018 election, which is when we did this study, how likely they were to discuss and share information about climate change, which we called discursive action, and then how likely they were to take political action like attend a protest or sign a petition. And then we also asked them about the emotions that they felt in response to the video, how much they enjoyed the video, and how much they counter-argued or disagreed with ideas in the video. And so in terms of effects on political engagement, we did find that the videos were effective, small effects, but effects nonetheless. But they were effective in different ways. And so compared to the control condition, the old people video, represented by that third bar there, increased people's efficacy beliefs or their sense that they can make a difference on climate change. We found that the CCDD video increased people's intentions to discuss and share information about climate change, as well as how important climate change was to their vote, again, relative to the control condition. The comedy videos didn't differ from one another or from the CNN video in their effects on these outcomes, and we didn't find any effects on people's willingness to take high-level political actions like protesting or volunteering. In terms of effects on processing variables, which were our mediators here, we found that the two comedy videos significantly boosted enjoyment and hope relative to the news video while decreasing fear. We also found that the comedy videos, especially the CCDD video, increased counter-arguing. And so this was unexpected given what we know about comedy's potential to reduce counter-arguing, but we think it's likely due to the partisan nature of the humor in the CCDD video, as well as the use of irony in the old people video. We had some qualitative data that showed that people were arguing against the idea that old people really don't care about climate change. So we next tested the indirect effects of the comedy videos. So again, the comedy videos increased enjoyment, hope, and counter-arguing relative to the news while decreasing fear, which is represented there by those red dashed lines. In turn, we found that enjoyment was positively related to discursive action and political action, and hope was a consistent motivator. It was positively related to all four of our outcomes. Fear also was positively related to climate vote importance, discursive action, and political action. Counter-arguing was a mixed bag. It was positively related to efficacy, but negatively related to climate vote importance. And so what we can see here is that both hope and enjoyment provided pathways through which comedy increases engagement, whereas counter-arguing plays a more inconsistent role. The arousal of fear is a benefit of serious news messaging when it comes to increasing engagement around climate change. And then finally, we looked at differences across political orientation. And we didn't find any differences on in terms of the direct effects of comedy on our political engagement outcomes. In other words, the comedy videos overall were equally effective in their effects on efficacy and climate vote importance and discursive action, regardless of one's politics. However, political orientation did influence the effects of the video on enjoyment, on hopeful emotions, and on counter-arguing, although not fear. And so the comedy in the CCDD video, which remember attacked climate deniers and called out Republicans, was less likely to be enjoyed by conservative Republicans. They didn't enjoy it any more than the news video, although they did enjoy the old people video as much as moderate independents and liberal Democrats did. They were also more likely to counter-argue the CCDD video than the politically neutral comedy in the old people video. We also found that the effects of comedy on hope only occurred among liberal Democrats. And so one reason may be that left-leaning audiences who already are predisposed to care about climate change, they may be more likely than other groups to see comedy as something that will inspire collective action around climate change, thus giving them more reason for hope, but that's something to unpack in future research. If we look at how political orientation moderates those indirect effects presented earlier, we see that the old people videos indirect effects on engagement via enjoyment worked for all three groups, all three political groups, whereas the CCDD video, the positive effects as a result of enjoyment only worked for moderate independents and liberal Democrats. The indirect effects of the comedy videos via hope were only significant for liberal Democrats. The indirect effects via counter-arguing also were only significant for liberal So few big picture takeaways from these results. First, comedy about climate change can boost political engagement, but it's neither monolithic in its influence nor a one-size-fits-all approach. The effects really depend on the type of comedic message as well as on the outcome in question. And so the Old People video, which was focused on empowering young people, did seem to have that effect by increasing advocacy beliefs. Whereas the CCDD video, which called out Republican lawmakers, had more of an effect on provoking discussion and emphasizing the importance of climate change as a voting issue. We also see that although comedy and news do not differ in their direct effects on political engagement, they work through different mechanisms. This suggests that within the broader media ecosystem, comedy can serve a distinct, albeit complementary role to more informational news-based discourse about climate change. In particular, we see that comedy engages audiences with climate change indirectly through its effects on hope and enjoyment, whereas news works through its effects on fear. And this finding is consistent with other research that I've conducted with Saul Hart, which has found that both fear and hope motivate climate activism and policy support. And so the availability of both serious, threat-focused, as well as more positive, hopeful messages is really important for public engagement with climate change. At the same time, comedy does not work identically for all audiences. It depends on individuals' political predispositions in combination with the political explicitness of the comedy. Specifically, we saw that that politically targeted CCDD video appealed less to conservative Republicans, whereas all three political groups equally enjoyed the Old People video and were more politically engaged as a result. And this is a really important finding in that it suggests that comedy about climate change can appeal across the political spectrum when focus on attacking deniers. So even the most dissenting audiences here, conservative Republicans, can enjoy comedy that supports taking action on climate change as long as they're not being attacked in the comedy. And so overall, what we can learn from this study is that comedy works to engage audiences with climate change by creating entertaining, enjoyable media experiences that inspire hope. And we actually found very similar things in other studies that we've conducted around the issue of poverty, and another related to attitudes work toward refugees in terms of entertainment value and hope being the key mechanisms. And people often incorrectly assume that comedy, because it's funny and entertaining, is inappropriate for communicating about serious issues like climate change, or that it can serve as a distraction from important problems. Yet our research in this book shows that it's precisely because comedy is funny and entertaining that it's capable of engaging and motivating people around challenging issues like climate change. So I will stop there and happy to take your questions.